Sex. How does it affect our lives, our minds, and our bodies for better or for worse? Welcome to this seminar, which is brought to you by the Marriage, Sex and Culture Group. And if you'd like to know more information about MSC, I'll put that in the description here. In this seminar, Dr. Joe Malone, who is well qualified in this field, addresses the tough social topic of sex in our culture and our lives through the lens of sexual wellness, sexual integrity, and science. In modern culture, sexual views and opinions have been weaponized to push cultural shifts and agendas. Dr. Joe equips his audiences, that's you and me today, to fight back with information and with facts based on science. This is the first of a two-part seminar series. Welcome to part one, and here's Dr. Joe now.
I was about ready to get out of the whole wellness fitness world, but had a chance to go to Middle Tennessee State and teach on a master's, and came across actually some research that comes from the UK originally. It's called Developmental Origins of Health and Disease, or maternal imprinting, or fetal imprinting, different names. But what it comes down to is the huge effect that a young woman, when she becomes pregnant and carrying the baby, her state of health has on the baby, his or her whole life, their health situation. So if she's in really, really excellent condition, literally the muscles, bones, and fat are what the baby creates itself off of. And if they're in great shape that way, everything gets built correctly: the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, liver, etc. If she's in the third world, for instance, and really, really underweight, the baby is born less than 5.5 pounds body weight, especially like down 4 or so. Defects get built in. And in the other end, where we are at in the US and maybe the UK, where our girls are like way overweight, way obese, and the babies are 11.5 pounds and bigger, especially as they get bigger, defects are built in. So I created a women's personal conditioning class at Middle Tennessee State. Somebody suggested that I do a PhD around this college women's wellness issue. In the process of getting the PhD, I interviewed a bunch of them, 32 of them in depth, and had 10 focus groups with the 10 of the classes, all women's classes that I created. And in it, all the different things that you'd expect, the problems with having time to work out, things that they had to eat on campus were horrible. But this other thing that they brought to my attention that I was really totally unaware of, hookup culture, really caught my attention, because I could see right off the bat that they were being damaged a lot more by hookup culture and this whole casual sex situation than they were by anything else I'd been looking at before. So I went to my committee, told them the situation, and said, I'd like to shift in the direction of sexual wellness instead of just overall wellness. So that's how that came about. And then the PhD specialization. And then 2017, the beginning of it, because I was not going along with the gender ideology that they were pushing so hard, actually, a lot of them were mad at me because I'd actually created a all women's class, which they didn't like to see women in anything different than the men's, men and women together. Even though they had the choice to take the co-ed class, the whole time, and 2/3 of them were choosing to take the women's class, by the way. So anyway, I got canceled. And at that point, I'd been writing the Battles of the Sexes, which had turned from an overall, kind of standard wellness book particularly for young women, into the sexual wellness book that it is now. And by the way, I think that you all have, a free copy of that coming, electronic copy. So please, I hope you enjoy that. But I believe God just put me on this pathway that I was never intending to be on, where I ended up becoming a specialist, particularly in, again, young women's sexual wellness. But you can't really talk, as you know, about sexual wellness without talking about both sexes. So I think that's as good of a short explanation as I can give. Does that work for you, Dr. Chan?
Thank you, sir. That is really helpful, and we salute and respect you for doing what you have done. You have paid the price, as so many have at this time. But a day of reckoning is coming when accounts will be settled. And
yes.
we have to do all that we can with the resources we have. So We pray God's blessing upon you, your wife, your family, and upon your work, your ministry, your finances, your health, and your future. May He pour great blessing upon you and into your life. May His anointing break forth in abundant measure, greater than ever before. And we now call upon the name of Jesus, that this will be a blessed seminar, that the name of the Lord will be honored, that our hearts and minds will be opened, and that you, sir, will be blessed as you speak to us now. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. So over to you now.
On that note, one other thing to add in, just as along the lines of your excellent prayer, the Princeton University got a hold of me going into that next year, and they'd read the book, and they said, of all places, Princeton University, and said, could you come up and speak at our conference, the Love and Fidelity Network conference? I had no idea that they had anything like that. So, which is they actually have these groups on all of the Ivy League campuses as well as Stanford. This will give you all hope, more hope than maybe you had before coming in. But all the Ivy League campuses have these Love and Fidelity Network groups, and then also Stanford, Notre Dame, Hillsdale. So there's a growing movement going on here, and that was 2018. From there, it's just been a bunch of other things. The pregnancy help movement, I'm working with them. So there's been a lot of blessings, and what you said is right. And I know that I'm talking to a bunch of people that have had experiences similar to mine, I'm sure, in the cancellation department. And again, the other note that I would make is that I know that I'm speaking to a bunch of brilliant people here, and a bunch of brilliant heroes, actually. So I do so humbly, and I'd like this to be us putting our heads together today and just really delving into this and seeing how the information, the knowledge that I have can help you in your work. Going to Einstein's quote, we're all ignorant, only on different subjects. So hopefully I can help with this subject with you guys. All right. So speaking of quotes, again, we're looking at sexual development. Again, feel free to jump in with questions at any time, but until I see one, I will just kind of forge ahead here. The quote I'd like to go to is the man who, or I believe it was Ian Donald, that one of the inventors, the main inventor of the sonogram. He said that the first 40 weeks of existence, he didn't use life, but he said existence, are more important than the next 40 years of life. And so I think that's a pretty good recognition, because from conception, especially to age about 22, but even 25, because that's when the kind of final maturation takes place. From conception to age 22, let's say, there's just a huge amount of activity going on. So what I'd like to do is try to share with you this, and in a way that you can share with the young people that you're dealing with, or anybody else that you're dealing with. And hopefully, it won't just be a blizzard of information coming at you. Hopefully we can stop along the way, or I'll try to, for sure, and kind of put together what the big picture takeaways are. Because I've sat through too many of these, presentations and lectures where all great information, a blizzard of it, a fire hose basically of it coming at us, but there never was any kind of conclusions drawn. And so I think it's important for us to draw conclusions as we go along the line. All right. So within about 3 weeks of conception in the brain, the brain, in conception, the brain of the baby, I'm just going to say baby, not fetus, and you know where I'm coming from on that. The brain starts differentiating itself, the cells of it. So we're going to talk about sexual development, but also the sexual development is taking place in just, again, a mountain of physical development that I'm going to try to intertwine and make you aware of. A lot of you may already be aware of this, but so if I say things that are, repetitive to you, please forgive me. Also, I may say things like synapse that you guys might pronounce differently. And so forgive me for that, for not using you guys' pronunciation. Think of it in the British pronunciation. All right. Male babies, one of the first things that most people don't know is in utero, male babies have adult levels of testosterone starting, it starts about 7 weeks after conception. It hits its peak about between 12 and 18 weeks, and then it starts dropping at 24 weeks. So the female body type is the default setting. If you didn't know this before, it's the default setting for all of us. We all start out with the female form of bodies. But if a baby has the XY chromosome, then almost always, there's a few exceptions that if you want to talk about, we can. And that's where you get the transgender, and other types of sexual orientation. But again, they're tiny numbers. That's where that starts happening. So about 8 weeks, you start getting differentiation as far as the baby's testes develop, and they start putting out testosterone if it's a boy, and you start getting that difference. And it's a huge amount of testosterone. Again, it's adult levels of testosterone that the male baby has. The female baby, on the other hand, just basically, is itself and kind of just goes along, and because it isn't difficult in nature for females to develop, because it's the setting that will happen if testosterone isn't applied. At birth, those levels in the male go down. They go down to almost zero. And then for whatever reason, and again, you can think nature or God designed it this way, they start rising to adult levels again at age about 6 months. 6 months, it's between birth and 6 months, so it peaks like around 3 months. And so once again, you get that really, really high level of testosterone. And what's happening is the very beginning, early in the pregnancy, the first trimester, it's setting the genitalia for the little boy. And again, you're going from a different situation, from the default situation to a new one. So it takes evidently more effort. And the latter part, the last 2 trimesters of the pregnancy, those high levels of testosterone organize the baby's brain. So it gets organized, in this case, into more of a male typical brain as opposed to female typical. And just for a quick side note, it's when, in those extremely rare, like 1 out of 20,000 times, you get a transgender situation. You get a situation where there's male exposure of testosterone in the beginning of the pregnancy, and then there isn't that same testosterone exposure at the end. And so the brain stays at the female setting. And so that's where you get on maybe 1 out of 20,000 times. It's actually 1 in 10,000 male to female, 1 in 3,000 female to male. So the female to male is much more rare. So that's again where you get the actual really, really rare case where you get a dysmorphia situation. Now, so after birth, so before in utero and then also after birth, on the male side of it, there's some heavy duty testosterone levels going on. It seems like, our creator or nature wanted to make sure that males, that brain and that genitalia get set and get set strongly. As we're going to see on the male side of things, sex is really a strongly imprinted situation as far as sex drive and all of that type of thing. And it starts early. On that line, raise your right hand if you guys would. Let's see. Got to get my hand there. These hormone effects actually start working on other things on us too. You might notice on my right hand that my index finger is shorter than my ring finger here. Does anybody know what that signifies? I was exposed to more testosterone in utero than I was estrogen. If you have a longer index finger, or maybe even with the ring finger, then it means you're exposed to more estrogen. Now, if you're a male, you can put them down. If you're a male and you have kind of the longer index, that doesn't really mean much, because the second big bath of hormones is at puberty, and for the most of the time that washes out any effect that you had of that, before birth. But it is something that may give you an indication that you may have, if you have that longer index, if you have a longer ring, let's say, and you're a woman, might mean you have more of a male organized type of brain than most females might have. So a lot of these hormonal exposures explain a lot of things. All right. So again, after birth, again, the baby boy, toddler boy, infant boy is going to have that high adult levels of testosterone until about 6 months, peaking at about 3 months. So there's really a strong imprinting as far as the brain goes at that point of male brain circuits in his little tiny skull. The females, they don't have the testosterone side of it, but they do have estrogen levels that rise after birth to about 8 times as high as the baby boy's estrogen levels are. So there is some mini puberty on both sides. And that's what we're calling that now, is mini puberty. All right. The time after birth to up to about 6 months of life. So again, there's a couple waves of all of this. If we catch on to the big picture of this, couple waves of development that are setting these two sexes on their courses biologically for life. That's why it's very frustrating. And I know you all have run into this, where people, give the impression that you can just kind of decide, what sex you are, and, socially constructed, sexuality. Nah, you were talking, Dr. Chan, about the science, and the problem is we just don't have the real science out there. We don't have the authentic science. So we're going to try to talk about the authentic science tonight. All right. So, and by the way, they call that digit ratio. They actually have a lot of research on that as far as what that says about people. Now, the other thing I want you to realize is, again, that the brain is not only developing sexually, but it's just developing, exploding in a like a hurricane of overall development. These are interesting stats if you want to jot them down. In this first critical period, which would be from birth to about age 5, as far as size development, the brain in both sexes, so this is where both sexes are similar, the brain of these babies doubles in size the first year. And then by age 3, it's got 80% of its adult size. And by age 5, it's got 90% of its adult size. So in a short amount of time there, the brain is exploding in size. Now, again, our species is we have the largest brain proportionally to our body size of any species on Earth, which has allowed us to do all of the things, allowed us to be on this Zoom here from my side of the pond to your side of the pond, for one thing. No other species is anywhere close to that, right? So that's important. The size is exploding during these, again, birth to about age 5. But along with that, it's not just the size of it, but it's also the connections, the synapses that are developing. And so from about age 2 to about age 7, we have connections that are being made according to what the baby is experiencing, or the toddler and the infant and toddler is experiencing. And that is you might want to jot this down, at 1 million synapses connections a minute. 1 million synapse connections a minute. So in this first brain growth spurt, which we'll say is from, let's just be holistic on it and say from conception to age 7. Again, it gets to its almost adult size by age 5. And then the connections that are made at 1 million a second, 1 million a minute, from age 2 to age 7, what they're experiencing is extremely important during that time period, as far as, again, their lifetime ability to know things and learn things and that type of thing. So obviously, if they're mistreated, if they're abused, if they're not, getting any instruction, if they don't have ideally they have a mom and a dad working with them, and again, what they experience, what they learn, this excess of neurons that they have, which is what they have at this point, the ones that are used are kept and the others are pruned. All right. So again, this is the big explosion of the beginning, at least the first one, of the brain's growth, and then the pruning process of what they use and what they don't use. All right. So from that, and again, that's up to age 7. So from age 7 to about 10.5 for the females and 11.5 for the males, the brain goes quiet again somewhat, and their activity, all of this kind of growth situation kind of quiets down a little bit, but it's only for about 3 years, because at age 10.5 approximately for females these days, and 11.5 for males. Anybody have any idea what happens? We had mini puberty earlier, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have
Puberty.
puberty, yeah, what we call just standard puberty. All right, and this is really important. Here's one of those take homes that I would recommend we all know about for what we do. Especially, I'm trying to address the issue of what we do in this field, working with young people to help them to understand themselves in order to understand, why they do what they do, but also what the other sex is doing, why they do what they're doing. At puberty, which is again about 11 and a half for males, their androgen levels, which androgen is testosterone and all the other male, primarily male, although both sexes have both of these. They both have different, they just have much different levels of testosterone and estrogen and even progesterone. Males' androgen levels explode at puberty, especially from about age of about 13 to 15. Okay, that's when the big explosion comes. From 10 to 30 times more than they had pre-puberty. 10 to 30 times more. So huge change. On the female side of it, their androgen levels, they're, primarily testosterone, but then some of the other ones that I won't name, they only double. Okay, so here's where you have the big change. Here's where you have, maybe you could have a female and a male swimmer swimming competitively, as a second graders, because they're real close in their testosterone levels. You get to like 8th, 9th, 10th, into high school age, they're not even in the same universe as far as their testosterone levels. So this is a place I would want us to stop and say, this is a take-home thing, take-home idea, take-home knowledge. A young man post the pubertal explosion is a whole different person to try to reason with on sexual issues than a young woman pre-puberty. Post-puberty, because she only has doubled her testosterone levels, and testosterone is a sex-seeking hormone. So it's a sex-seeking hormone. Estrogen is a sex-receptive hormone. Okay, so again, this is where the big difference comes in. The big sex difference really begins between the two sexes. And so in trying to socialize towards sexual integrity, which I've found kind of is it's kind of the root of all the good in our society, or at least most of it. Reasoning with a female post puberty is much more probably likely to succeed than reasoning with a young man, because young men's testosterone levels, hit their highest level at 17, basically. So in our system over here, I'm not sure about you guys's, but that's about a junior in high school, and then seniors like 17 to 18. So my first take home big idea that I would advocate is our efforts at promoting sexual integrity should be skewed in the direction of the females if we want to try to make the best progress possible, because they're the ones that are going to have the ability biologically to listen better. And what the research has shown is that they do socialize in that direction much easier than these boys and young men. All right. Any questions on that? If not, let's move on. So again, we have these, two explosions we have these different explosions. Again, prenatal explosion of testosterone with the boys, and postnatal, just 6 months, the first 6 months of birth. And then at puberty, there's another huge explosion where they kind of just leave the females behind as far as the amount of testosterone they have. So again, the research on sex drive and sociosexuality, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and all of that, again, basically biologically shifts over to where they're hypercharged on all of these areas as far as sexuality goes, pornography and all the rest of it. And so then we get into, again, after in the second growth spurt of the brain coincides with that, because basically the second growth spurt of the brain, as far as many more neurons that are needed, and then the pruning process takes place from adolescence to begin. Well, let's just say puberty to about, let's say, early 20s. And then, the ideal thing to, maybe the way to think about it is the prime time for this is Uh, Probably the most important time in this time span we're talking about is that what we would call undergraduate years here, in the States, from about 18 to 22, because that's when the next thing I'm going to explain to you, that's when that happens as far as like solidifying the different changes that have occurred. And again, like the first brain growth spurt from conception to age 7, the experience that these young people from, let's say, again, about 11 to about age 22, the experiences that they're having really shape what their brain comes out, to be like. It's really the last part of it there, that 18 to 22 time period, is really the worldview shaping time for both sexes. So the female side is still a little bit ahead on their development. They get to the maturation earlier. And so the males, it's a little bit later. So, you could say 25 or so for the final maturation. But they're close in there. And it's during this time period. And again, the maturation of the brain is particular because it's maturing from the back and low, so the cerebellum basically, to the front and high, which is the prefrontal cortex. And again, the prefrontal cortex is where we have our executive functions, our judgment, our right and wrong, conscience, what we call conscience now. So again, in the high school years, the middle school, high school years, the young people, both sexes, they're not really equipped to put the brakes on some of their impulses as well as they will be later. The time that I'm talking about, like, again, college for us time, that's when it's starting to solidify. And I think one of the reasons that those of us, that are of a conservative persuasion, we've had less success with the college age group is that the folks that are on the leftist / even communist side of things, they realized for a long time that that's a very strategic place to try to input, and so we need to get into that area as far as being able to influence them. The prefrontal cortex, again, as I said, develops last. And then there's one other thing you may want to jot down. The gamma aminobutyric acid. You don't have to necessarily have that, the whole thing. GABA will bring up any kind of research for you. GABA, all capitalized. That sets itself in place during that 18 to 22 year time frame as well. So that is the brain's major inhibitory neurotransmitter system. So the combination of the prefrontal cortex maturing, I always use the analogy, and I've taught both high school and college. So I use the analogy with both of them of when you're younger, like the high school years, you have almost no brake if you're a car, and you have all gas pedal, and you're getting more brake as you're going into college and that type of thing. So that is, again, both of those the brain growth period and connection period of the conception to age 7 is the first critical period. That's where the brain is most plastic. And then it dies away for a while. And then the second growth spurt is when it's most plastic again, as far as in our lifetime. And again, it's called critical periods, critical development periods. You may have heard of this before with children and such, that maybe are deprived of sight during some of that time period. They're not able to, for whatever reason, not able to see, and they're never able, even if they can restore their sight, should be working fine. They didn't have sight when they were going through the critical development time period for sight, and so they're not able to ever see like they should be able to, or same thing with hearing. So basically, again, the big take home from this is that from puberty to especially the end of it, the second brain growth spurt and the second critical period, which would be the end of it, would be about 18 to 22, in some cases going all the way up to 25. On the male side of it, probably more up to 25. Crucial if you want to be able to have young people that can critically think and can be influenced by the truth of the actual science. you want to speak into, especially that last time period. And the other takeaway is that probably all the way through that time period, on the female side of things, they're going to be more open to a message of sexual integrity as opposed to sexual anarchy. So I will stop there. And that's basically development from conception up to approximately age 25. And again, just one other summary on one side of it, on the male side of it. And this is absent what we've had in the last 10 years or so, especially, but absent the effects of pornography, high-speed internet pornography, which, especially on the male side of things, I think dampens down the normal sex drive that they would have towards, the actual females side of things and that type of thing. But even so, the basic, and also it wouldn't take into effect the dropping testosterone rates over the years, the last 40 years or so, for different factors, and the dropping sperm counts and that type of thing because of the pollution and all the other things that we know have been going on, unfortunately, in this time period we've been living through. So discounting that is basically the situation where you end up with a supercharged sex drive on one side, the male side, and you end up with not so much of a charged sex drive, and much more dependent on their cycles on the female side of things. And we can talk further about that as we go into the next two sections, and we will. So are there any thoughts or questions that I can speak to now? I'm not very good at keeping up with the stuff, when it's written in the chat.
Dr. Joe, I've kept an eye. We've got two questions, actually. One is from Paul, who raised his hand. So that's question one. And question two is from Alan. How can young men be taught to understand their sex drive? So perhaps I'll come back to that. We can take Paul's question first. Paul, why don't you speak your question out?
Thank you, Chan. I just wanted to ask you, Dr. Malone, if there's obviously different levels of testosterone and estrogen between a male and a female. Anyone that is gender confused or saying they're gender confused, is there no way of measuring what their levels are and saying to them, well, you're obviously being open to being socially engineered to the other sex? Because we know that teaching in the schools particularly is leading young children to choose their gender opposite to what they are. So is there any way because we're always being told to look at the science.
Yeah, that's a great question, Paul. And thanks for asking it. Levels of testosterone, as the child develops into a young person and then, a young adult eventually, those do have some influence. But the key thing, and I'm glad you asked this question because I didn't pick up on this the first time I did this research either, but the crucial thing as far as sexual orientation seems to be what happens prenatally. Again, that what the children are exposed to as far as testosterone levels versus non-testosterone levels, and also the timing, first trimester versus second, third trimester. So, again, in the rare cases, and again, like I said, 1 in 10,000 male to female transgender situation, 1 in 30,000 female to male is the frequency of it. And then 1 in 5,000, what do we call it? Intersex. So that intersex happens 1 in 5,000 where you have ambiguous children are born with ambiguous, actually both maybe, sexual genitalia. It's basically set up, prenatally. So what's happening with them hormonally as they go on through their, development, they're born and they go through their development, is secondary to what happened to them in utero. So that in utero time period, as Ian Donald, the inventor, maybe said, has huge consequences as far as the well-being of the child, all the way out into their, way into their middle age time period. So that's what I would say is we don't have the technology right now, and especially with live humans, it's different. They've worked on cadavers as far as the size of different parts of the brain, and I'm going to get into that, in the second part here. And so without knowing that, it probably helps us a little bit helps to some degree to have their present testosterone level, but it's really what happened before they were born as far as their organization of their brain. That's probably the number one question we need to ask. And again, I keep emphasizing this tiny numbers of, in this case, transgender and also intersex, 1 in 5,000. But it's still small as well, with the just flat out LGB, anything that isn't heterosexual is under, the realistic number would be somewhere under 4% of the whole population. So people have taken and created this huge number, of all of the things I just named, and it really isn't representative of the physical case of it with the actual science. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Now, what was the other question, Dr. Chan?
Yeah, so in fact, one is come through, another one has come through as well. So there's a relationship between them, I think. How can young men be taught to understand their sex drive? That sounds like a verse from Psalm 119, actually. How can a young man keep his way pure? By taking heed thereto according to your words. That's possibly the answer, but let's have one from the science. And Gary has asked a question. I'll try and ask. Gary's question is about pornography. Does that mean that there is a mismatch between male and female interest in pornography? And does that apply across different age groups? I think there are 2 levels to that question. Mm-hmm. So perhaps you could address those, please, Dr.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, and now I'm thinking of the pornography question now, but what was the first one again? How do young men, how can they be made aware? First of all, I think, what we're talking about here, this knowledge, which I found is very, very few people know this these days, even. First of all, you all knowing it and you sharing it, I think is the first step. I know that when I did the research on this, much of it that I didn't know, and it's helped me tremendously as a fairly high testosterone male to self-manage better. So I think that is one thing. And the science, actually, the real authentic science, not Dr. Fauci's type and the rest of them. The science is helpful, I think, along with you named it, Dr. Chan, the scripture, because it's the verse that you pointed out in Psalms, but there's also several others. If you look at chapters 5 through 7 of Proverbs, basically there's several things in there about young men as far as how to, handle themselves in sexual situations. Also in First Timothy, there's advice given to Timothy by Paul, the older man, to the younger man, of how to think about, all of them, older women, younger women, older men, that type of thing. But particularly with the younger women, he's told to think about them as sisters, and then also with all purity, that type of thing. So the thing I find interesting that you can pass along to, to young men that you're dealing with is, and if they're believers, if they, church attenders, that type of thing. By the way, the research has shown that they're less vulnerable to all these sexual problems, the ones that are, it's interesting, church attenders, young men, and then also lower testosterone. That combination is a really good combination as far as not getting into sexual trouble. But there is that I know of, similar analogy to this in the Bible as far as instructions to girls and young women, which makes sense if you're a believer, because God created us, so the maker's going to know how the product that he made works. And so that's, again, a key thing with young men and boys, is that they have that tendency. Again, like I said about myself, that as I discovered these things, it made I was able to think about my own thoughts. I was able to practice metacognition, thinking about my own thinking. And that's something I think we need to teach our kids in general, but especially the boys, metacognition. Think about your own thinking and why you're feeling the way that you are. So that's that one. And then the other one, pornography. Pornography it's the elephant in a lot of rooms these days. And yes, it is a mismatch, and I like your words, between the two sexes. I'm going to get to it, but there's like 6 times the number of young men that get addicted to pornography than the young women. But as I'm going to mention later, I'll mention it right now quickly. Things are a little bit changing because of the situation. There's an interesting and probably important fact that we should all know that research has turned up, that with females, the younger that a female experiences arousal, sexual arousal, the earlier, the more of a higher, I guess you'd say, sociosexuality index she's going to have. And in case you're not familiar with sociosexuality, it's the kind of the amount of casual sex tolerance that you have, or promiscuity, we would put it. So higher promiscuity with the younger, and also just openness to all sexual things, basically. So I'm afraid that, and that research, by the way, was done about 2006. I'm afraid that a lot of our girls these days are being exposed. The average exposure here in the U.S. is about, age 10 to age 13. And by the way, that's, again, kind of coming right up to the puberty time period, or in the puberty time period. So it's a bad combination. I think we're getting more young females that are finding themselves enmeshed in pornography than we ever had before. And it's because of the exposures, I think, that they're getting at young ages that are unnatural. Most of the things we're talking about here are unnatural, goes against our sexual nature, basically, that are, putting us into these situations where we have many more, maybe future female porn addictions than we would have had in the past, if that makes sense. That's a great question. Other questions?
Dr. Malone, can you just clarify that statistic? The average age in the US, 10 to 13 for girls, is that for them getting into pornography or experiencing early sexual arousal?
That's for both sexes, for first exposure to pornography. And there isn't really a stat so far on what age the girls and young women are having their first sexual arousal experience. I don't have research that I know of on that, but the research that was done on it, like I said, it was about 2006, where it was taken note of that early sexual arousal seems to affect females in more of a provocative way than it does males. It didn't seem to have as much of an effect on the males having sexual arousal earlier, but it did the females. Again, this is 2006, so it's before the internet porn, age that we're in now. So, does that make sense, Dr. Chan?
It does, and thank you. And just to add a rider to your point that the scripture does speak much of young men, the Proverbs is full of that. The only scripture I'm aware of where a woman's proclivity towards sex is expressed by way of a command or a caution is when Paul speaks about younger widows and becoming wanton. So is that something that you think is scientifically rooted or perhaps more rooted in the society of the day?
That's a good question. Yeah, you all have some great questions here. My intuition on it is that, because again, hopefully these are good things for all of us to know. But with the male testosterone levels reaching their peak at 17, and then holding that peak all the way through their 20s, and then just starting to slowly go down, maybe a percent per year, after about age 30. But then the females really hitting their peak, what the research has shown on them is they hit their peak in their late 20s and then into their 30s, as far as their sex drive, their amount of fantasy and all of that type of thing. I think that the wisdom of that scripture would be that, presumably a woman who was married and then, became widowed would probably be maybe in that older, the 30s time period in her life. And the other thing is, after I think a couple have had sex and, been married, having sex, and suddenly you don't have that partner there anymore. In a lot of cases, there, when the body gets used to it, it's a much different situation than when you haven't ever had it before. Again, especially on the female side of things, I believe. So I think that's the wisdom of, again, our maker, the manufacturer specifications, in knowing that probably that element, because of the older and the matured woman. And again, the science on that seems to go into the idea, the idea behind it scientifically is that women hit that later peak, again, going into their 30s, especially like mid 30s, because they have waning fertility, and the mind and body know that. And so there's a higher drive in order to, if they haven't had children, if they haven't had very many children, to become pregnant, have more children. So that would be kind of the science behind it. So I think there's a lot of, as always with the Bible, there's a lot of wisdom in all of these things that are prescription for us, basically. Does that help?
That's perfect, Dr. Malone. Shall we move on to the next sections?
Sure. And we're looking at things that women need to know, and both about men and themselves. This is really, really important. That, again, big old take home right here. Women need to know these things, particularly young ones. So hopefully you're going to have a chance to get some of this across with them. First of all, they need to know that men's bonding response, I'm going off my notes here so I don't forget anything. Men's bonding response is more complex than women's. Okay. And again, both sexes, what I found is that young ones, especially, they have a tendency to think that the other sex is thinking just like they are, but they're actually looking through lenses that are a lot different, as you're going to see. And hopefully you'll be able to see from, the background that we set up, kind of the development, that there's this huge mismatch in the testosterone department, the sex-seeking department. And so we shouldn't expect anything, different than that to have a huge sex difference. And that may be the biggest sex difference that there are. I mean, that may be the biggest difference between the sexes overall, is that desire for casual sex on the male's part, and many males, although not all of them, many males wanting multiple partners if they're available. Girls and women should know that right off the bat. But to put it another way, a men's bonding response is more complex than women's. Then what I mean by that is that the chemical process is more complex. Men have a chemical in great degree, more than the women do, called vasopressin. And for a man to bond, most men to bond at least, vasopressin has to be in the brain long enough in order to create receptors and then lock. Now, what we're talking about here is men need vasopressin, dopamine, and testosterone in order to bond. And in your typical hookup situation, there's plenty of testosterone going on there. Your typical casual early sex, early sex compared to the beginning of the relationship. And when a young man has that situation where he's having sex with one girl, maybe on the first date, and then maybe 2 nights later, he has another girl that he's having sex with right off the bat, vasopressin, which is the bonding chemical for males, never is kept in the brain long enough to create these receptors. So what needs to happen, and again, this is biblical, and it's also, old school tradition, the dating, the courtship, the, chaste, people get mad at me sometimes for using that word, but chaste relationship between the young man and young woman, the situation where he's opening the door for her, and they're going to movies, they're going to dinners, they're doing all these things where they're around each other. He's extremely attracted to her, but they're not going to bed. They're not having sex. That's what happens that's what's needed. Romance is required, I guess you'd say, by most young men in order to fall in love, to bond, okay? Because the vasopressin then, if this is a vasopressin receptor, 1,000,000 times bigger than it actually is, the vasopressin in his brain, because he's been around her, they haven't had sex, he hasn't had an orgasm, which the chemicals from the orgasm, your serotonin, your oxytocin, your opioids, wash the vasopressin out. Again, the way we've been made, I think there's a purpose there. Anyway, the vasopressin isn't in his brain long enough to create these receptors, and then the molecule bonding actually with it, docking with it, and for him to create that first bond and kind of get territorial about her, because that's what vasopressin does. One of the things it does. Now, when the vasopressin does that, when it happens, then that secondary bonding takes place. So it's a two-stage situations with the males. Oxytocin, which he has as well, but which is antagonistic to testosterone. And if the testosterone levels are too high, the oxytocin bonding can't take place. When he bonds vasopressin wise, the testosterone drops. In fact, every time a male commits on any level, his testosterone drops. So girlfriend, boyfriend, engagement, marriage, and then it drops a lot when they have children, if they handle the children, if they're holding the children, that type of thing. So once the vasopressin lock takes place, then his oxytocin can swing into action. So he bonds again doubly there. And that's when you have a properly bonded male with a female. And again, the old school pattern of no sex before marriage, that's why that worked the way that it did. Again, 1960 and back here in the United States, we had a 5%, out of wedlock birth rate. And then, by 2010, we have 40% overall. In some ethnic groups, it's much higher than that. So that's the first thing. Along with this, something is really important for especially the females to understand, because a lot of them, I've had some of them tell me their parents are telling them they have to have sex with a guy these days in order to get them to, in order to get them to hook them, basically, which is, if you hear me, what I'm saying is actually the opposite scientifically. Relatedly, men see promiscuity in a potential marriage partner as kind of a deal breaker, very negatively. If a man, oppositely, if a man finds out that a woman is hard to get sexually, he will intuitively feel that she is more likely to be faithful in their marriage. And therefore, sexual integrity and sexual loyalty are the most highly valued traits in a woman that a man is considering asking to marry him. That's something these girls need to know, okay? Because I haven't found too many of them that didn't want to have a long-term relationship and didn't like the short-term relationships. This is something that goes way back into our history, if you want to talk about it scientifically. Again, something called female choice and paternity certainty. Female choice is going back, if you want to go millions of years back, like 2 million years back, when actually this monogamy that we're talking about really got going, and really, again, founded, again, if you're talking scientifically, founded the human species. This is what a female had to do, is they have to pick out somebody who's, maybe they're looking for good genes, they're looking for a good looking guy, strapping, physically capable, that type of thing, but also somebody who's going to be there when she's pregnant and carrying this baby and trying to, again, in the hunter-gatherer days, trying to survive, because a baby takes 500, being pregnant takes 500 extra calories a day. And then breastfeeding takes 500 calories extra a day. And after you've had 2 or 3, babies, you got a couple toddlers and you got another one, in the hopper or breastfeeding. It's something that our ancestors, as opposed to chimpanzees, our closest genetic relative, we share about 99% of DNA with them. That doesn't happen with them. Their males don't stay with their females. And therefore, people that are scientific about this would say their brains never developed. We have 3 times the size of brains of theirs, and ours did. They have a promiscuous mating system. And I don't know if we probably don't want to get into that right now, but just take it from me that their bodies are different, a lot different. You can literally look at a species and you can tell, what kind of a mating system they have. And ours is primarily monogamous, and theirs is primarily promiscuous. And if you want to talk about the details on that, we can later. But the other thing that women and girls need to know is the reason there's such distaste for, as far as a marriage partner, a potential marriage partner, for a promiscuous girl, is that paternity certainty is the other thing. So if women have female choice and it's dual, it's both good genes, but also the kind of man that's going to be there and is trustworthy and all of that. Paternity certainty is on the male end of it. Humans internally gestate, and so it's one of those things where only the woman really knows who the father of the child is. And so males want to know who they want to know that the babies that their wife is carrying is theirs. And so it's a big deal as far as what kind of person she is sexually to them, to consider her to marry. Men, and because of that, have a tendency to categorize females right away. They categorize if they're easy sexually into just for a good time only, and if they're not easy, they categorize them into the possible marriage partner. So, again, most girls and women don't know that. Here's kind of a for instance on what I just said. After unmarried intercourse, a woman's evaluation of the man goes up. In other words, for a woman to bond, all she needs is dopamine and oxytocin, and she gets lots of those in the sexual situation. If sex even to orgasm basically really pops both of those up. So your typical situation will be the females will be bonding with this guy that they just hooked up with, and the males won't. Okay. What the male is thinking, and this isn't all of them, but especially the ones that are highly sexual active, probably the alpha males, the high testosterone guys, within 10 seconds after having orgasm with this unmarried partner, his evaluation of her is going down. She's less pretty to him. She's less, valuable to him. And all the things that you can, plug in there as well. At the same time that's happening, her evaluation of him is going up. She's seeing him as a better person, that type of thing. So it's, promiscuity is really a losing game for both, but especially for the females. One other thing to cap this off, and by the way, we don't have time to go into this tonight, but we are a monandrous species. It's hard to say whether we're, monogamous or polygynous. If you know what polygynous is, again, one male and several female, wives. Because we seem to have a history way back, before the 2 million years, we seem to be primarily polygynous from the body types, from the fossil record. Much bigger. There's a much bigger difference between the size of the males and the females. And that's what you get in a polygynous type of mating system. We've really evened up a lot, though, since the last 2 million years, as far as the size of our males and females. And so we're tracking towards more and more monogamy. But again, because of that situation, and that's probably why there's so much a hypercharged situation with the chemistry and anatomy of the brain for the males, because of that polygynous history. And also, if you can think about the Old Testament, in the Bible, and Jesus really ended this, but polygyny was very common with the patriarchs. Many of them, most of them, if you think back, had multiple wives. So that changed with Jesus, saying that one man, one woman, that we were created that way. So that probably makes sense of why all the things that we're talking about here, the sexual conflict really that we're talking about, work the way they do these days. But here's something for you to remember. What the research has shown is that the shorter the time to sex in a relationship, the shorter the relationship. I'll say that one more time. The shorter the time to sex in a relationship, the shorter the relationship. And that's what especially girls and young women should know, because generally they're the ones that are in the driver's seat. They're the deciders, generally, when and whether sex occurs and when it occurs, because the males always seem to be the ones that are pushing it, and they seem to be the ones that are reticent to it, hopefully. And it isn't just in our species. That's pretty much across species. The species, by the way, that are reticent, that especially their females, practice what we're talking about here. And again, they're more equipped to be able to practice that because of the way what I've described earlier. There's a correlation between them and intelligence, high intelligence. So species that are monogamous have a higher tendency to be intelligent. There's a correlation there. That should be known too. And by the way, on the male side of things, the top 20%, this is interesting, the top 20% of intelligent males are the ones that are most open to exclusive relationships. So you have the top 20%, let's just call it sex IQ, because that's the way I look at sex IQ, is the ones that can discern the value of an exclusive relationship. Again, they're interested in the same thing that the majority of the females are. So on the female side, I think about 80%, 85%, maybe 90% are interested naturally. They have high sex IQs. They're interested in the exclusive relationship. But there is this probably 10 to 15% because of prenatal exposure to testosterone and different reasons. Their brains are configured differently than most females. They're okay with hookup culture, and they're actually more on the side of pushing the envelope sexually in the same way that most men do. And I think, with everything we're looking at here, feminism, the radical type, not the original type like Hannah More that you had in your country and that type of thing, that were actually Christians at the time, that they were doing good things for the family. But the type we've had since then that are pushing girls and women into being sexually active when it really goes against their sexual nature, really are strategically destructive, because when you get the girls and women going in the direction we're talking about and taking that natural block off of just casual sexual activity, that's where you get to the mess that we're in now. So and again, one more time, girls and young women should remember that every time a boy or young man commits, his testosterone drops, and he's going to have more of a tendency to go to the next step and more of a tendency to go to the next step. So it's when it's a free for all, the way it is now with hookup culture, that all this stuff gets thrown out the window. All the rules from the Bible, all of the traditional courtship, all of that, it just becomes a mess. It becomes sexual anarchy as opposed to sexual integrity. Now, moving on, because I know we're time's getting short. Men, their brains are configured much differently sexually than females. There's 3 areas in their brain that you should know about that are over twice the size of the same areas in the female brain. The medial preoptic area, MPOA, which is, as it said, would infer, is right behind where the optic chiasm from the eyes come in. So that's one of the reasons that males have a tendency to have more of a roving eye. A lot of women don't really understand why that is, but there you go. It's over twice as big, and it's packed with twice as many neurons. It's twice as much density. Same thing with the INAH3, and I won't go into you can look that up if you want, INAH3. It's another part of the hypothalamus, which is the seat of human sexuality, really. It's twice as big and twice as packed with neurons. Same thing with the amygdala, which is the brain's command and control area. It's twice as big in the males. And all of them are reactive to testosterone. And remember that testosterone runs about 20 times more in males than in females on average. And another chemical that you should know about in here, sex hormone binding globulin, SHBG, which actually binds the action of these sex hormones. So the more of it you have, the less free testosterone or whatever. Women have 13 times more of that than men do. So basically, it's a huge mismatch, again, between the male and the female brain, as far as sex drive and all the things that are associated with it. It makes men a lot more vulnerable to the Coolidge effect. If you've heard of that before, shake your head if you've heard the Coolidge effect. Okay, so anyways, just basically it's named after President Coolidge. I don't have time for the story, but males have a tendency, if there's a novel female available, to be willing and able to have sex with them. So, and that's not just us. That's rats, rams, cows, all kinds of different males from different mammal type species can do this. Promiscuity is much harder because of all these things to resist that for males. Another thing that women need to know is men tend to over-perceive women's sexual interest. A woman will just be being nice to the man, and she'll respond being nice, being courteous. He'll think she's sexually interested. And so that's where a lot of sexual conflict comes as well. On the other hand, women tend to underperceive men's sexual interests, which causes a lot of problems as well. When males become aroused, they become much different ethically. The research they did on this was college students, and they had them, sit in front of laptops, and they had pictures of the country, pastoral pictures, and we're asking them questions like, would you ever give a date rape drug to have sex with her? Would you ever tell her you loved her? Would you ever tell her would you ever consider having sex with a 12-year-old? all answers all no. And then they put pornography on there, and then they also asked them to up the ante. They asked them to masturbate while they were watching the pornography. They started asking the same questions, and you can guess what the answers were. They all changed to yes. So women need to know that in an unaroused situation, a man may be one type of person and a whole different person when they get into a aroused situation. I think that's why a lot of our hookup situations, here's a number for you. 80% in the United States, at least 80% of the non consensual sex takes place in the context of a hookup. 80% of non-consensual sex, sexual assault, rape, etc. So it usually isn't the guy jumping out from behind the bush in the parking lot. It's the guy that you're in the dorm room with or whatever. Another thing that women should be aware of is that, as far as men, is that chemicals in their semen affect the women psychologically, positively. There are endorphins, serotonin, prolactin, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. By the way, FSH and LH can bring on a woman's ovulation. So again, if you're married, and this screams marriage, it screams monogamy. If you're married and you're having sex, it's beneficial. It's beneficial between the two partners. If you're not, and you're trying to avoid being pregnant, and you're trying to, wearing condom, and that type of thing, it isn't working the way it was intended to work. One last thing here on that women should know is that, as opposed to our swimmer here, Thomas, I think is his last name, men and women are not the same at all as far as their physical capabilities. In most cases, men on average have 80% more upper body muscle fiber. So that's 80% more upper body, and 50% more lower body muscle fiber. So if there's any kind of a spousal abuse situation, it's usually going to go in one direction. And I think you know which direction that's going to be. All right. That's what women need to know about the men. Again, you can see there's a whole different thing going on from her perspective to his. Now, what does she need to know about herself? These are important as well. Probably, if we don't get through all of this tonight, by the way, I would be happy to come back if you're interested in, if we don't get through it all tonight, come back and do a second, part 2. What women need to know about themselves. I've already gone over part of it, but early sexual arousal raises females' sociosexuality. These girls that find themselves attracted to pornography and probably wouldn't have been in the past, if they've had a sexual, experience as a young girl, and a lot of it may be abuse of some type, something that they didn't choose themselves, but they were sexually aroused, makes them more vulnerable to that. The other, and this is a huge take home here, this next thing I'm going to say is very, very big, and most people don't understand or realize it. But alcohol consumption raises women's testosterone levels. Now, it raises both sexes' testosterone levels up to a point. If generally the young men are drinking so much that it actually raises it to begin with and then lowers it because they overdrink the limit. Doesn't seem to have any dose requirement as far as raising women's testosterone levels. And so it raises their testosterone level. They're not used to it. They're not used to the effects of higher testosterone. And so a young woman can really become a different animal, so to speak, while they're drinking, as far as sex goes. Now, sex drive and sociosexuality, especially if she's naturally cycling, if she's not on any kind of birth control, hormonal birth control, and so her cycle is natural, and she's anywhere near her ovulatory window, which is that, day 8 through about day 14. During that time period, if she's drinking, she may be, again, a whole different person, somewhere on the same level with a high testosterone male. And again, I think this is known by the fraternities and that type of thing on the college campuses, and that's why alcohol is such a feature, in all these parties and that type of thing. Even if she's not drinking, that fertile window, the ovulatory window, whatever you want to call it. So if her period is day 1. Let's say days 5 it ends, and then 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. That 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 is the time she's going to have that much higher sex drive than she would normally. And women, need to understand this and know this about themselves and realize that, again, it's all subconscious or unconscious, however you want to express it. They may not realize why they're doing the way that things the way they do them anyway. They dress more provocatively. This research has shown they're more flirtatious. All these different things. Again, a lot of it is not they're not self-aware of it. All right. Females are much more vulnerable to all the bad things. And again, that's why, again, this whole feminism has been really hurt, I think, women in so many ways, because it's taken them out of this natural place they've had of being honored as, again, the sex that you want to respect, treat them with deference. They've got something you want as a young man, and you're going to have to marry him to get it. And again, all of it kind of works in that direction. Also, you're probably going to get married sooner if you can't get it otherwise, a younger age. And that's a positive, as we're going to see here in just a second. But females' anatomy makes them much more vulnerable to STIs. The vagina has thinner skin. It's easier to penetrate by viruses and bacteria than the penis. The vagina's moist and warm environment lends itself to all kinds of bacterial growth. Witness yeast infections that women get and men almost never get. When they do get an STI, oftentimes it's asymptomatic. And so they get pelvic inflammatory disorder, which turns many of them infertile. PID, they call it. Women on average have 8 times higher HIV risk and then 4 times higher gonorrhea risk. The risk really, really goes up for HIV, though, if anal sex is practiced for either sex, but especially for women, because they have the choice of vaginal or anal sex. It goes up. HIV risk goes up 17 times with anal sex. That's something almost nobody knows either. Now, here's a real kicker for y'all. Young women's sexual behavior during these years affects their future health. And this particularly isn't what got me into this. It was the effect of their health on their babies. But this really spoke to me when I first learned this. If they begin their menstruation early, it raises their risk of uterine cancer. So all these female reproductive cancers are influenced by this. And this probably isn't her fault, but our society's situation where we've allowed this divorce at the rate we have, the situation where there's so many of our kids coming up in households where it's just the mom and mom and maybe a boyfriend or stepdad. What they found in the research is that an unrelated male in the household has a tendency to start her menstruation earlier, and that again causes problems down the road for her as far as risk of cancer. So, as a society, if we could do something about that, that would help them. These innocent girls that would be healthier right off the bat if they have a mom and a dad, biologically their parents, in the situation. Early promiscuity leads to higher chances of vaginal and cervical cancer. So again, early hooking up leads to much higher chances of vaginal and cervical cancer. This is where it really gets interesting. None or minimal numbers of pregnancies and none or minimal breastfeeding raises the lifetime chances of developing ovarian and uterine cancer. And a lot of times ovarian is fatal, as you probably know. So the old school picture of, because they're not having sex until they're married and, they're romantic, again, they've got the hormones fully in place by 17 or 18, and they're getting married maybe at 19, 20, 21, 22. And the female's peak fertility is age 19 to 29, and the male's is 24 to 26. They're hitting that peak fertility time period by being married and starting to have children, having before, hormonal birth control, and even, before condoms, which was 1845 is when the condom was patented. So back most of our years, that process of getting married younger, starting having children younger, having more children, breastfeeding them, all of that's protective for a female's reproductive cancer chances. Delayed childbearing and fewer pregnancies raise the risk of lifetime development of breast cancer. And breast cancer has become a scourge, as you may know. You probably know somebody who has breast cancer. And we've got 100 times more breast cancer now than we had in the past, in our ancestors' years. There's more reasons for it. We don't have time tonight for, but I'm happy to talk about that. It's in the book, by the way. You can see that in the book. But I'm happy to discuss it with you if we want to at a future time. A woman who has her first child, now hear this, a woman who has her first child around the age of 20 has half the chance, because half the chance. So the ones that have them around the age 20 has half the chance of developing breast cancer as a woman who has her first child around the age of 30. Breast cancer became the number one cancer diagnosis at the end of 2020. Another reason not to like 2020. And overcame lung cancer. And remember, only 1% of people who get breast cancer are males. So it's 99% of them are females. One last thing on this. Women with 10 or more lifetime sexual partners. So that's 10 or more lifetime sexual partners. Recent research, and this is UK research, by the way, have a 91% higher risk of developing cancer. So 10 or more lifetime sexual partners. Males have an increased cancer risk as well if they have lots of sexual partners, but it's not nearly that. It's like half that. Hookup effects on females, 78% of women regret them. Women are more depressed afterwards. They have lower self-esteem. They have higher general distress. And many of them want it to turn into a relationship. And so, again, that's probably the last way that you actually, as a woman, want to try to create a relationship is hooking up with a guy. Last thing here, hormonal birth control and its effects. Can really have some bad effects. One is that it can make a woman attracted to a genetically unsuited man, because what it does is it makes women think that they're pregnant or in their luteal phase, which is the second half, when they're not sexually motivated and that type of thing, when they're not attracted to more masculine men, it puts them into that state permanently. And so they end up marrying somebody who totally maybe isn't attractive necessarily to them, or wouldn't be if they weren't on birth control. Somebody that's going to make a good dad and maybe physically doesn't have a real great genetics, but they're great guys. They would be a great husband, great dad, and all the loyalty, all the good qualities that way. The bad thing is that if this couple is on birth control, hormonal birth control, in order to keep a pregnancy from happening, and then, they get married and then she goes off birth control. Oftentimes she's no longer attracted to her now husband because he's genetically not suited to her. He's more like a relative or her, a close relative would be to her as far as the way she feels about him. So that's a bad situation. And then this is really a nice study that was done in Denmark. It's been kept quiet, but hormonal birth control, especially the types that aren't oral, like the patch, IUD, vaginal ring, they have a tremendous effect as far as raising depression levels on females, and particularly the young ones, age 15 to 19. And I say tremendous, meaning that in the hundreds of percent, 100% greater chances of being depressed, the ones that are on them. The reason I say it was a great study is that they used, the sample size is over a million Danish women. They followed them for, 15 years or something like that. So pretty hard to argue with that as far as it being, applicable to the whole population. Hormonal birth control dampens sex drive. That's bad if you're trying to get pregnant, and just generally within a married relationship. You combine that with antidepressants, and it's really bad. Antidepressants plus hormonal birth control is really destroys most women's sex drive. And so the combination is really bad. The other thing that they covered up in the trials of it was it raises blood clot and cancer risk substantially in different types of cancer, but blood clot risk was really high. And then again, they covered that over in the trials. So that is what women need to know, both about men and about themselves. And I know we're coming up on time here, and we were going to look at what men need to know about themselves, and what women, what they need to know about women, first of all, and then about themselves. But I'm going to stop there, second section, and just ask you if you have questions about what we talked about, and I'd be happy to try to address them.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Malone. And it's good that you did give time to that. And I'm fairly certain, but we'll discuss with Lisa, and I'm certain we will need to have you back, and also having sampled this content to tell others about it, because it's the absence of knowledge that leads to people, whether in pastoral or other professional or in even familial situations, to be unable to have intelligent conversations with people. You know, some of these things we know intuitively and instinctively, and from Christian social conditioning, but having science makes all the difference and leads to a constructive conversation with naysayers, and also with people who say, well, it's the culture, it's the way things have changed, we've just got to rock with it. No, we don't, unless we want to have the end of the species. That's what Agenda 2030 is about, of course. So that's one reason why there has been this increase in it. Can we just clarify a couple of points? I didn't quite get this. So in the last couple of sections, you were dealing with the dangers of hormonal birth control. I have to say, I've talked to a number of men I've met in gyms whose wives have just decided to leave them. And I think this tells us why. And sometimes they've left them with the children. And this, because of the increased use of of hormonal birth control, this tells us that there is a physiological change that's taken place in women that has led to this destruction in families. The increasing depression by hundreds of %, which was found in a Danish study or studies. Which aids were these? I didn't quite. Unfortunately, I wasn't typing fast enough. Which were these?
Well, this is it was kind of what I wasn't wanting to have happen, a fire hose of information, but I'm glad to go back over it now and clarify and get the takeaways, the big picture takeaways. So great question. I've got time, for as many questions as you guys want, and then also I'm more than willing to come back and we can go take a look at the males, the younger ones, age 15 to 19. So again, the ones that we would hope wouldn't be sexually active anyway, they're the ones that had the tremendous increases in depression rates in the hundreds of % for the patch, the IUD, the vaginal ring, all the things that aren't your oral types of hormonal birth control. Although the hormonal birth control for these young ones especially was in the 50, 60, 70, 80% range as far as raising depression rates as well. And along with that, as we all know, it raised suicidal ideation and also suicidal attempts. So there's a real serious situation going on with that. The younger, during that, they're 15 and 19, they're still in the midst of that second growth spurt of their brain. And then also the pubertal changes as far as their hormone levels go, seems to be really disturbing on them. And in general, that 15 to 19-year-old time frame really needs to be handled carefully in all the things that we do. I know here in the U.S. on that note, a lot of our physicians here, if a girl has an abnormal cycle, they'll put them on birth control pills. If they have this, that, or the other, endometriosis, they'll put them on them. They use it off label for a ton of different things here. And I don't think the physicians are aware, of the potential downside of this. So, and as far as the wives leaving the husbands, that's something that's a sad situation. I'm smiling about it, but on the inside, I'm not smiling. Because it in many cases, I think it's just because of this biologically biochemical effect that these drugs are having on these people that they just accept as just like taking candy or whatever, and they don't realize how much they actually change them as a person. That they literally change their personality to something that it wouldn't be if they weren't taking them. It's easier for us to see if we look at steroids, anabolic steroids. If you've ever been around, a gym, which, as you know, from my past, I've spent a lot of time in gyms. guys, we accept pretty readily that if guys kind of take anabolic steroids, which is synthetic testosterone, basically, that it changes their personality in a lot of cases to a lot more aggressive, a lot more, short-tempered and that type of thing. It changes who they are, really, their personalities. Well, women are just doing the same thing, just with estrogen and progesterone, different combinations of the two. And so, we shouldn't be surprised that it changes who they are. And then again, especially when they go off of them and they're married to somebody that they, courted with, went through courtship with and got married and were attracted to them during the courtship in the way they were. And then they go off the pill, and now they're more attracted to more of a higher testosterone, maybe male, more masculine, that type of thing. And they find themselves fighting against not being attracted to their husband. What a horrible situation to be in. So again, the old school thing of maybe we can just avoid the birth control if we don't, start practicing having sex until we want to have children, after the marriage. Again, with the people I work with, the young people, it's hard to argue with the old school and biblical respect, for each other. The young man respecting the woman and not putting pressure on him. The young woman knowing that that it shouldn't take place, sex shouldn't take place till after marriage, and knowing that she really holds all the cards. She has the superpower. That's what I talk to our girls about. You have a superpower. All you got to do is say no. And again, watch what happens. Because as they say, males will come up to the level of what they're expected to. they'll get to the bar that the women are expecting as far as availability of sex. If it's this low, they'll be glad to jump over that low bar of just show up for the first date and we got sex. If it's this high, and again, it raises her value if it's this high. If the attraction's there, that he's strongly attracted to her, and she drives him crazy, he's going to go to that level in order to get where he needs to be to be able to be with her. And feminism has really tried to destroy that. And I think that it's intentional, and I think it has to be remedied. As to somebody's comment earlier, and I think it was these have all been great comments and brilliant insights on a lot of people's points. But one other thing that should probably be known right now before maybe we have another conversation is that when you look at the history of sex, and I'm looking at an expert right there with Dr. Lisa. I've done a fair amount of research on it lately myself. And when you come to the modern era, we've actually had 3 pendulum swings between sexual anarchy and what I call sexual integrity, the sexual anarchy, sexual integrity, up to 1660. And you guys, this country is a real good example of this with the Victorian era, but up to 1660, up to kind of where the Enlightenment, as the so-called Enlightenment gets going. We had a fairly sexual integrity pretty much in society across Western societies. And you can measure that by, out of wedlock births and that type of thing. From 1660 to about 1800, that changed in the Enlightenment era. And it seemed to go along with kind of the French Revolution and kind of the political climate changing in the direction of leftism, so to speak, which seems to be a characteristic of it all the way through. But then around, before 1800 with Hannah More from your country and William Wilberforce and other people that were making in 1760s or so up into around 1800, the strides they were making in reforming manners. They had, I can't bring the exact name to mind, but there was a whole backlash movement against this sexual anarchy. And so coming into Queen Victoria's era, the Victorian era, the pendulum swung hard the other way, and the out of wedlock births dropped. There's all kinds of things that gave the indication of what I think makes a society function at its optimal level. And it's not just me. I mean, objectively, you can look at what happened from 1815 to 1915, and there was no major wars. Probably the most human progress was made as far as where they were going into it to where they ended up, as far as what was invented. There's a man named J.D. Unwin who you may be familiar with, but he did a study on it in the 1930s the more sexual restraint a society had, and he studied about, I think, about 80 to 90 different societies. The more sexual restraint they had, the higher their culture went, and the lower the sexual restraint they had, the lower their culture went. So we have up to about 1920. You know, we have the sexual integrity time period paradigm, and then 1920 going forward to now, it's swung back, as you guys would all agree with me, into more of a sexual anarchy, and with the emphasis on anarchy, you know, in the what we're going through with our society. So, for people who think that there's just been a linear change, you know, from the beginning of humanity, which again, if we want to go scientifically, would be about 2 million years ago. Homo sapiens, I'm not Homo sapiens, but just Homo erectus. To now, if you want to look at, we want to say it's linear. Well, things have just, you know, they used to have stringent monogamy, and you know, just with all the different things we have going on now, it just continued. You know, when we were kids, it was better, but it's, the further we go along in time in a linear fashion, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse as far as sexual anarchy goes. No, it's really been cyclical. You know, history is cyclical. And so whoever said, I think it might have been you, Dr. Chan, that no, we're not going to just take this, you know, we're not just going to say, well, it's never going to get any better, you know, because society what did Obama say? And somebody before him, but something about the arc of history bends in a social justice way. Well, again, we kind of can question what he means by justice and that type of thing, but it's been a history of from sexual anarchy to sexual integrity and back and forth. If you look at the Old Testament of the Bible, there's a whole lot of examples in there of them practicing a bunch of things they shouldn't have, and then getting straightened out, and you know, going the right direction, and it happening again. I mean, sometimes I wonder why the Old Testament is there for us Christians. I think that's probably one of the main reasons, is to see that history is cyclical, and when you do things the way God directs us to do them, it all comes out a lot better.
Amen. Well, that's very powerful stuff, and I want to respect people's time, but a comment I would make directly about you, Dr. Malone, is that your words and your voice are prophetic. I believe you are a prophet to this generation. And the words that came to me from another prophet, a Bible prophet, was ask for the old ways, and where the good paths are. And it's extraordinary and wonderful that the discoveries that you and others have made, and which you are now codifying in your literature and in your lectures, are actually helping to give voice to those prophetic statements. And what is a prophet? A prophet is someone who tells forth the truth from God, because only God is truth, so that we may find that good way. So where we are, many of us on this group are part of an organization, a movement that's seeking to bring about change. We don't believe that destruction is inevitable. We know the meta-narrative of Scripture, and we're pursuing that. Having your talk, I believe, especially for the marriage, sex, and culture group, and I'm addressing Lisa on this, I think it's a great boost. It's even a booster, shall we say, to make it relevant to these COVID times. But it's a godly booster. And I know that I speak for all of us who've been on this call, and many who we will speak to, because we have a tendency to share these things, that there will be a great deal of appreciation for the extraordinary diligence that you've applied in order to bring this to us. Because in the space of a relatively short period of time, please be assured, you've not given us a fire hose, you've given us rain from heaven, and I'm sure that it will bear good fruit as we go forward. And I'm almost certain that we would really be wanting to have part 2 or even part 3. And our intention would be especially to bring this to the attention of Christian leaders, both in formal religion as well as in youth groups and others. People need to be aware, and in fact, they need to be aware whether they have religious a religious background or not, because these matters are self-evident truths that we need to make people aware of. So thank you so much. We won't take any more questions just because of the time, but can I please assure you of our gratitude, of our appreciation, and of your love, both to you and your wife and your family. You will certainly be in our prayers. We have regular prayer meetings. I lead a prayer meeting on Sunday evenings with communion on Zoom, and we will make you and your work and ministry the subject of our prayers and prayer support.
Wonderful. Well, I'm humbled by all of this. Again, I wish I could get to know everybody on the call, because I know, like I said earlier, I have a bunch of brilliant heroes on it. I know Gary McFarlane, for one. I know what a brilliant hero he is. And I would love to get to know any of the rest of you. On that note, if any of you want to contact me, just get a hold of me. As far as I would be willing to just one-on-one, in a Zoom type of situation. If you have further questions about what we've talked about so far, don't hesitate to get a hold of me. I think we all have the email addresses, right? Or Dr. Chan, can you give him my email address, please?
Yes, I can
I can individually answer any questions or have a conversation with you. So I'm humbled of the things that you said, Dr. Chan. My wish and my prayer is everything you said goes forward and is true, because that's what I want to be. I want to be a servant to as many people as I can in this area. And I'm humbly grateful to have been able to spend the time with all of you distinguished folks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malone. You will be in our thoughts and our prayers.
Thank you so much, everybody. And don't be bashful. I'm here for you. I'm your servant.
Thank you, Dr. Malone, and thank you all for attending. May God bless you. Have a fruitful and peaceful rest of the day. Shalom to everyone.